All right. So I will keep relatively basic and brief and then leave it open to questions afterwards. So today's topic will be protein. So just briefly, a little bit about me. I'm in the MD MBA program at and a bit of a nutrition geek. Just don't necessarily consider myself an expert because I feel like I always have more to learn. But I'm here to share what I have learned so far. So disclaimers, that's my first one. I don't know what qualifies an expert, but I don't think I am one. And then my other disclaimer is this isn't my usual setting for talking. Usually it's more like an official lecture format, teaching nutrition at the school to a bunch of geeks that want to see data. So I'm going to try to keep it a little more casual today. All right? So starting off with the basics, what is protein? And then we'll go into some of the common questions about protein goals for athletes and things like that. So protein, obviously, dietary protein, we're talking about one of the three main macronutrients, protein, fat, carbs. But in the body, most of the molecules that are necessary for physiologic function are made of protein, like hormones, enzymes, collagen. These are all different forms of protein. So that's why it's important. We think of it just in the context of building muscle. So the building blocks of protein are what we call amino acids. I'm sure you've heard that. The most common ones, there's 20, and then of those, there's 9 that we call essential amino acids. And what that means is it's essential to get them from diet because you can't produce them yourself. So what are the goals for protein? So first I'm just going to say the general population goals, and then we'll get into for athletes. So when they came up with the RDA, or the recommended daily amount, they came up with 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is pretty low, but this is for the goal of preventing protein deficiency. Kind of an unnecessary goal because especially here in the US, we're pretty overfed, and as long as you're eating enough calories, you're going to hit that goal of protein. You don't really hear people going to the hospital for protein deficiency, right? We go to the hospital for a lot of other issues, not getting a lot of other nutrients, but no one really goes for protein deficiency. So that's the first number, 0.8 grams per kilogram. That's at a population level. And then we get into what are the goals for athletes. So the most recent research shows somewhere in the range of 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight is really where you start to plateau in terms of gains. And that's regardless of protein source. Now, what are some, for the most part, for most of us, that's pretty sufficient, even if you stay on the higher end of 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. What are some considerations where you might want to go higher? I would say 2 main ones are if you're in a significant caloric deficit, where you're cutting, let's say, and you really want to try to maintain lean mass, then it probably would be wise to go up to like 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. The other thing also, where I would up my protein higher, is if you're not resistance training. Like let's say you're injured and you're not able to train for a few weeks, then I would really make sure you're getting your protein higher. And I'll explain kind of the reasoning behind that a little bit later when we talk about the anabolic window and things like that. So we talked about protein goals for athletes. Let's get into the anabolic window. So I'm sure you all have heard that term. I think has anyone here rush to get their protein right after a workout because you're like, I got to make the anabolic window? I've done that. I think we all have. Not as much of a thing as we thought it was before, and I'll kind of explain the reasoning behind it. So there's constantly 2 processes going on within each muscle tissue. There's muscle synthesis and muscle degradation, and there's a balance between these 2. And you could have certain triggers for muscle protein synthesis that will then make you net in that direction where you're building muscle. So what are some of the triggers? One is resistance training. Just resistance training in itself causes some muscle protein synthesis, and then protein, specifically certain amino acids such as leucine, is a trigger for muscle protein synthesis. So that's why we pair this idea of you resistance train and then you eat protein to maximize muscle growth. And the thing is, the way it works is, let's say you need a certain threshold to trigger muscle protein synthesis, a certain threshold of protein to trigger that process. What resistance training does is it essentially sensitizes the muscle to these anabolic effects of the protein and the specific amino acids. So this threshold that you need to hit is lower after resistance training. Does that make sense? No. Okay.
One more time.
Yeah, no worries. I'll explain it again. So the reason why we try to eat protein after resistance training. So let's say you need X number, let's say you need 2 to 3 grams of leucine, right, from protein to trigger muscle protein synthesis. If you resistance train, your muscle is sensitized to the effects of leucine, so that threshold drops lower. So that's why you ideally want to pair resistance training with protein intake. And so this idea of the anabolic window is, okay, while we're in this state where we're sensitive to the effects of protein, we want to maximize that. However, we've shown now the anabolic window is not like we thought it was. It's not like an hour. Your muscle is sensitized to these effects for 24 hours past your initial resistance training. So if you hit a chest day, you don't need to rush to get protein right after. What matters more is your total protein in the day. So it's not like a wasted workout if you don't get protein within an hour of working out.
You're set. Do a longer run. I don't want to ask you a question.
No worries. So we can get into later on, like if we do a Q&A at the end, how these goals differ for strength training versus endurance training, like for runners. So that's one of the common questions I get, the anabolic window. So it's not necessarily a thing. You're sensitized to these effects of the protein, these anabolic effects, for a long time after your workout. All right, let's see what else I wanted to cover. I get a lot of questions about protein supplementation. Is it necessary? So it really goes back to what matters most is the total goal of protein. So going back to those numbers that I stated at the beginning, hitting those amounts. So if you're hitting those amounts from just your diet and food, there's really not much need for a protein supplement. It's generally a matter of convenience for most people. So if it's more convenient for you, you're really busy, you don't have time to like make a ton of meals or buy a ton of meals, then yeah, that protein supplement might help. So it's more of just, again, that total protein goal for the day. And that kind of brings me into what happens to, I know you were asking me this question earlier, what happens to excess protein? A lot of people wonder, like, is there any benefit? Once you've kind of used all the protein for muscle growth and all these different functions in your body, what happens to excess? There's a few things. One, it's still a macronutrient. Each gram of protein gives you 4 calories of energy. So one, you can burn it right away and use it for energy. It depends on what your metabolic needs are at that time. Another thing that can happen is it can get converted to glucose through some boring biochemical pathways. And then that glucose can either be burned if you need it or stored as glycogen if you need glycogen stores in your muscle. And then lastly, it can get converted to fat. So if you're in a fed state where you don't need any energy at the moment, depending on your metabolic needs, excess protein just gets converted to fat. So that, and then lastly, protein sources. So I get a lot of questions about, does it matter in terms of where you get your protein? Because you're trying to get protein, does it matter where you get it from? So those numbers I cited earlier, these studies looking at that range of 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, had several arms in the studies, and this has been repeated multiple times, where regardless of protein source, as long as you're hitting that sufficient amount and you're getting a variety of protein sources, you still get the same level of muscle growth. And so that kind of brings us into considerations for, okay, if the source doesn't matter much for athletic performance, what about from a chronic disease risk standpoint? Because when you're eating these protein sources, it's not just protein that you're getting. You're getting different sources of fat, different subtypes of fatty acids, so saturated fat versus unsaturated fat. You're getting different levels of fiber, different levels of nutrients. And so the way I see this is kind of like a spectrum. So in terms of protein sources and disease risk, it's nice because I can make general statements, because it's not like, oh, red meat is worse for diabetes, but like plant proteins are worse for heart disease. It's all really the same thing from a chronic disease risk standpoint when we talk about like our major killers and like what most of this country has. And so we got some background music. So the way I see it is kind of like a spectrum. And we have some good, what we call substitution analyses now, which I kind of like in nutrition research because it's not just determining the health of one food, it's comparing it to something else. Like, what if I swap this from my diet for something else? So, the spectrum that I kind of see is really kind of on the worst end is going to be your processed meats. I think everybody knows that, like your deli meats and things like that. And then from a heart disease standpoint, red meat is probably next, even unprocessed red meat. You want to try to limit that to, the recommendations are 3 servings per week maximum, and that's from like the World Cancer Fund organization. Yeah, unprocessed red meat. So everything also is dose dependent too, you know? So like having, 10 servings of red meat a week is going to be very different from 1 serving of red meat per week. So everything's very dose dependent and what you compare it to. And then you kind of move into, and that's mostly because of saturated fat content, which is more metabolically harmful to your liver. As a general rule, keeping saturated fat to less than 10% of your calories is probably a good idea. And then from there, you kind of move into the white meats, which are still kind of rich in saturated fat, but less than red meat. And then you get into fish, low-fat dairy, and like plant proteins I would put in the same risk category from a chronic disease standpoint. And so trying to move more towards those, but ensuring you get enough total protein will help from a prevention standpoint as we all get older and don't want cholesterol in our arteries and stuff. So, yeah. Any questions now? That's kind of like, I tried to hit the main things that everyone asks about with protein. So
Risks from eating too much protein on your liver and for kidneys.
yeah, so that's a interesting question. I mean, protein intake when you already have oh, sorry if you guys didn't hear, the question was too much protein and the effects on your liver and kidneys. So when you have chronic kidney disease, you want to limit protein intake. But from a prevention standpoint, it seems that the type of protein matters more. Obviously, you don't want to get excess protein because there's not much benefit from it. So there's no really need for overkill, which is kind of what we talked about before. It's either going to get stored or burned.
You hear about kidney stones from people that eat way too much of a protein supplement.
Yeah, so it depends on the type. I actually, in this document, have like a article that was weighing out the different types of protein and the risk of kidney disease from that and kidney stones. So again, it goes a lot back to animal versus plant proteins, and there's a lot more evidence now showing that the disease risk and the risk of harm to the kidneys and all these different organs is less with plant proteins than animal proteins. But again, it's kind of like a spectrum. So if you have a lot of red meat in your diet right now and you want to swap it for white meat, that's still like a beneficial substitution. You know what I mean? Or fish or whatever you want to change it for. Eggs. So eggs are really interesting. I think eggs are a great way to highlight how nuanced nutrition is, right? So, because you can't just label a food as good or bad. So I talked about comparator groups. So if you've got someone eating a ton of eggs a day and they swap it for red meat into their diet, you'll see their cholesterol go up. General rule. If you swap it for plant proteins like lentils or tofu, their cholesterol tends to go down. So again, what are you swapping it for? But then it also depends on the person. So everybody has a different tolerance to how many eggs, let's say, they can eat before it starts messing with their lipids in their bloodstream. So there's what we call hyper-responders, and that's more of like a genetic predisposition. So some people are more sensitive to the effects of dietary cholesterol. Because eggs aren't super high in saturated fat. There's 3 things that can raise your cholesterol: trans fats, saturated fats, and dietary cholesterol. And in that order, they have the most impact. So trans fats will increase your cholesterol the most. We don't see it much in our food supply. They're pretty much banned now. Saturated fat next, and then dietary cholesterol actually has the least impact. So that's what's in eggs. Yeah. So, and then the next question is, what's the dose? So if you look at a lot of these studies, like you can find studies showing both ways, like, oh, no association with heart disease versus yes association with heart disease. So you have to look at what the dose is. So some of them are comparing 1 egg a day to 2 eggs a day, and you don't see a difference in risk. But then you have some studies comparing 2 eggs a day to 6 eggs a day, and you see an increase in risk. So this is where dose matters and personalizing your own goals. So let's say you eat I had a patient recently who eats 9 eggs a day, and I was like, probably not a good idea. And he didn't want to go on cholesterol medication. I'm like, all right, so you're eating like a steak every night, you're eating 9 eggs, 4 slices of cheese. Like, these are places where you could probably cut down on your saturated fat and dietary cholesterol intake. So again, it's very dependent on the person, what you're swapping it for, what the dose is, and what outcome you're measuring. So like 2 eggs versus 6 eggs might give you worse outcomes from your heart disease risk, but it might not change your cancer risk, or it might not change your diabetes risk. So it's very dependent and nuanced. So I like using eggs for that example because the same person, like you eating 3 eggs a day, might have a very different impact on your diet than me eating 3 eggs a day.
I had a blood test once for allergies, and I said I was allergic to eggs, but I've never felt any type of issue. So I mean, I don't want to get into that, but like,
yeah,
some people have allergies to certain proteins potentially.
General rule is don't go looking for problems that you don't have. So if they told you, yeah, and if like your lipids look okay and all your biomarkers of disease risk,
worse.
Yeah, and so
than eating like a hard boiled.
Yeah, so that's another thing when we look at research on different protein sources. So like fish, for example, we see different outcomes in the research depending on where it was conducted, because here in the US it's a lot more fried fish as opposed to other countries where they're eating a lot more fresh fish. So these are all things you have to consider. I know sometimes you'll have people go online and like that don't have a lot of like scientific literacy with nutrition research or research in general, and they'll be like, well, there's studies showing both sides, so I'm just gonna do whatever the fuck I want. Can I curse on the live stream?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm gonna do whatever the fuck I want. Yeah, more questions. Throw them my way. Yeah.
For the plant protein, is tempeh better than tofu, or are all those proteins kind of equal?
Yeah, so it goes a lot into, for the most part, as long as you're not getting everything from one protein source, and as long as you're hitting that total goal, like those numbers that I gave at the beginning, if you're shooting for 1.6 grams per kilogram. Now, there might be other considerations of what might make one better than other. So, like, just some examples. I told you leucine is one of the amino acids that's highly, quote, anabolic, that triggers muscle protein synthesis. So, let's say you're getting all your stuff from plant proteins, all your protein. For example, like I get protein powders that have pea protein because pea protein is one of the ones that's higher in leucine. For the most part, I think we don't need to obsess over the essential amino acid content of each protein as long as you're eating a varied diet and hitting that total goal. Everyone, if you tracked it, ends up hitting all their goals, and there's a plateau there. Another consideration, you were saying like tempeh versus tofu. So tempeh is fermented, so you might get some better benefits from the probiotics in there, So just different considerations, like nuances like that. But if we're just talking about from a muscle building standpoint and an athletic performance standpoint, it doesn't matter the source. Is there anything I didn't explain well that you guys want me to like explain again or in a different way? Yeah.
Question for like BCAA.
Yeah.
How does that come in? Like, you have some of those like supplements. What would that do? Does it actually help anything, or what would that?
Yeah. I used to think they're helpful because, like, in theory, but when we look at the data on it, if you're getting enough protein from your diet, it doesn't make much of a difference. And also, yeah. So it's just it's just some of the amino acids. So they're called branch chain amino acids, and that's just based on the chemical structure. And so these are ones that people, I believe it's like leucine, isoleucine, and valine are the ones that are branch chain. Don't quote me on that. I haven't taken biochem in a few years, but and like getting those in a certain ratio, people thought, okay, that'll cover all our bases to make sure that we have maximal muscle protein synthesis. But if you're getting enough from your diet, which most people are that are cognizant of it, it seems like more of a waste of money. Which is how I feel about a lot of supplements. I think sometimes there's this idea where people hear like great benefits of certain supplements because they hear someone talk about like, oh, I felt so much better on this, and they start taking things for no reason, and which can come with its own dangers too. Like the supplement industry is highly unregulated. Obviously, like big pharma has its issues too, but when you look at like the wellness industry, There was a study I saw recently where they sampled a bunch of supplements on the market and they tested them, third-party testing, and only 7% had exactly what they said they did in there. It's kind of crazy. Like, you have no idea what you're getting.
Impurities.
Yeah, you have no idea what you're getting because there's no regulation. Like, at least the FDA is regulating food and drugs.
Some companies provide
Yes, so some companies provide third-party testing results. There's another supplement recently that was like an anti-diabetes supplement that I saw. They got in trouble because they just had prescription diabetes medication in there, and they were just selling it over the counter. You know, so just something to keep in mind. If you go to a doctor and you're deficient in certain nutrients and you can't get them from your diet, or you have certain health issues, then yeah, supplement with that. But I think people go overboard and waste a lot of money on supplements, in my opinion. But going back to BCAAs, for the most part, probably unnecessary. If you feel like you're maximizing your muscle growth from resistance training and your total protein intake, there's probably other places you would want to put your effort on where you're going to get more benefit from improving your health. Like, what I tell people is I said earlier, nobody's protein deficient. Nobody goes to the hospital for protein deficiency. But 95% of the US population doesn't hit their fiber goals. And if everyone did, like, we'd see much lower rates of heart disease, diabetes, all these things. So it's about where we focus our effort on health. Like, I think protein's really important, and maintaining lean mass is really important from a metabolic health standpoint. But it's not the only thing to consider in health. Does that make sense?
Two-part question. The most important, runners.
Okay.
How does a 20-mile run affect your marathon or an ultra affect your depletion of body's resources and rebuilding it properly, and how fast, especially the window? And then the second question, Impossible protein, which we talked about, which I don't use ever, but because I don't trust it, and I don't think the research is there yet. But what's your research seen on that, and is it safe in genetically modified proteins?
Yeah, both good questions. So I think it's to the first question, which was protein goals for endurance athletes. It's very activity specific. Like, what your goals are going to be different from someone else's goals than someone who's only resistance training. So one of the considerations of why, as a runner, you might want to have a higher protein intake goes back to what I was saying earlier. If you're burning a ton of calories and you're in a caloric deficit, it's going to be harder for you to maintain lean mass if you're burning more than you're eating. So you might want to consider having more protein. So I think that's one of the main considerations as a runner, especially if you're doing long distances, you're burning a ton of calories. Yeah, trying to get in protein wherever you can. Oh, one thing I didn't cover that's really important, and I'll get to your second question. People ask, and I think you asked me this earlier to touch on, about absorption. How much can you absorb in one meal? So for the longest time, it was like, okay, there's no point in having like 100 grams of protein at once because it makes no difference. Like, you kind of plateau after 25, 30 grams.
30 to 35 grams.
Yeah, in that range, like between 30, 40 grams. But there was one study published earlier this year that actually suggested that it's more beneficial to get way more protein. You still get some benefits and can absorb it in one setting. Now, keep in mind, it's one study, but what does that mean in the context of like studies are cool, but how does that translate to what you do in your day-to-day life? So that's an important consideration for someone that might not have, like, with their schedule, the time to spread out their protein throughout the day, so they can still benefit from. It all comes back to hitting this total goal.
I've been told in the running store industry is 30 to 45 minutes you need protein after a run, otherwise go catatonic. Is that a myth?
I mean,
This is like after 20-mile run, remember?
People make it sound very black and white, like you're either building muscle or you're losing muscle, but these are two processes that are happening at the same time, like muscle degradation and muscle synthesis, depending on what tissue you're in. So
after a long run, like, your body is just like almost about to die.
Yeah,
like,
so
you need stuff fast.
getting protein would be a good idea after a long run. Like, there's no downside to that, and replenishing electrolytes if you're. No, I don't have a. There might be, not that I know off the top of my head.
You just feel terrible after like 45 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's no downside, but I don't, off the top of my head, have like a hard number. And then you asked me about Impossible and like imitation meat. So that's a good question, because we have like decades of research showing like disease risk is lower with plant proteins over animal proteins. But now this is relatively new, having imitation meats and stuff. So there wasn't much research on it. And now in the last few years, I've seen, because I don't know what I would recommend to people. Like, is it better to just have some unprocessed red meat, or to have like an imitation plant meat? And now we finally do have research on it. So there's 3 or 4 good studies that I've seen that compare where one arm of the study gets unprocessed high quality red meat versus the other arm gets the imitation meats. And what we saw in all of them, was lower LDL and other markers of heart disease in the imitation meat group, which kind of makes sense because the saturated fat content's lower and all these things. But we have to remember, it's also not outcome data. These are markers of heart disease risk, but it's not necessarily telling us 20 years out who's getting heart attacks and who's not. So I can't tell you definitively, but based on the current research, it seems like still a more beneficial substitution than unprocessed red meat. Does that make sense? At least based on the available data right now. And I think over the next 20 years or so, we'll get more outcome data. And that kind of goes back to, there's a huge range of processed foods, like what qualifies as processed. So like, there's, like, if you take an apple and cut it, that's technically processed, right? But there's, a bag of chips, that's also processed. A plant imitation burger, also processed. So we have to think about what actually makes processed foods in general more associated with weight gain and heart disease risk and all these things. And generally, it has to do more with the fact that in processed foods, they're hyper palatable, so that means you can just eat a lot at once without realizing it. You can get a lot of calories in. They're usually high in sodium, so that's another thing. And so those are kind of the main things, that they're not rich. You can eat a lot at once, so now you're getting a lot of, quote, empty calories. So when you look at something like a bag of chips, you could eat like 1,000 calories in Lay's at once. Hello. And versus something like, if you look at like Beyond Meat or an Impossible Burger, it's low in saturated fat, low in sodium. So arguably very different than like a bag of chips. Does that make sense? So there's a huge range of processed food. So at least based on the available data, it seems like it's still a beneficial switch to unprocessed animal products, mostly because of the saturated fat content. And they're coming out with newer and better ones. So like, I know the next generation of Beyond Burger, they lowered the saturated fat content even more and the sodium content even more. And the previous studies were with earlier versions of it, and it still had better effects on like your lipids and things like that.
For the heart or for because they're genetically modifying soy and combining it with other things like yeast and and then there's Elon Musk is going to take it to Mars. So I'm just a little concerned that we haven't. The scientists are trying to come up with the best protein, but I think we already have the best proteins on Earth.
Yeah.
Why do we need that? I know it's a little bit of an opinion.
Yeah. So I think when you look at why do these exist, like these Beyond Burgers and Impossible Meats. So there's a few reasons why someone might, like, you have to think about the fact that someone might have completely, like, motives that are completely unrelated to health, right? So if someone's taking it from an ethical stance of they don't want to eat animals, then they're just going to have something that tastes like meat and they don't really care about their health if it's good or not. So that's kind of one of the things. For people trying to transition to more plant-based proteins, it's more of a bridge. Yeah, exactly. So it might be more of a bridge. But at least based on the available data right now, it still seems like it's a better option than...
It's not causing any dramatic harm because they would have found it out by now.
Yeah, we haven't seen any negative impacts. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, I was saying, do you think if there is a significant amount of soy, like, is it possible to make this stuff? Do you think it outweighs the protein intake? Do you think it's worth it essentially?
Like, what's the concern?
Well, like, I've just heard there's a lot of soy in a lot of these impossible meats.
Yeah.
A good amount of soy usually isn't good for that. I could be wrong.
Yeah, so that I gave a whole 45-minute talk on soy because there's a lot of misconceptions about it. Yeah, so I think if it were an issue, I would have double D's right now. That's the short answer. But no, so it's a valid concern because plant phytoestrogens, they're called, are structurally similar to mammalian estrogens or our own endogenous estrogen. And so that's kind of where the concern comes from. But we have a lot of research now showing that it doesn't have the same impact because it's very weakly binding the estrogen receptor. So it's actually blocking the actual estrogen from binding it. So if anything, it's having more of an inhibitory effect than anything else on the estrogen receptors. And it also depends on what tissue you're in. So, for example, like for the treatment of certain cancer, endometrial cancer, we use what we call our selective estrogen receptor modulators. So in some tissues, it'll have a pro-estrogenic effect. In some tissues, it'll have an anti-estrogenic effect. And so it also depends on what tissue you're in. But we have like a lot of research with soy intake in men and women, and it doesn't affect hormone levels because it's these plant estrogens are having very different binding to the receptors. That's kind of the short answer. There was one case report of a guy who was drinking, I believe, 2 gallons of soy milk a day, and he had some issues. But I think if you drink 2 gallons of anything a day, you'll have some issues. Yeah. So I don't necessarily think it's a concern, and I think there's actually more research now showing that it's actually probably more like there's certain benefits because there's certain compounds in soy called isoflavones, and we see like Asian populations, bless you, Asian populations eat a lot of soybeans, and they tend to have lower disease risk than we do. Now, obviously, that's an association of looking at a whole population, and you can't isolate one variable, but they tend to have lower disease risk and they don't have issues with that soy intake. So even a quote high soy intake of studies in America is going to be very different from a low soy intake of studies in Asian populations. And you can look into like, I can send you a bunch of resources. Like I just cited a bunch of stuff in my notes for all the stuff we talked about today. So I can send you stuff. Yeah.
What is your answer when you're plant-based? What's your answer for like so you don't get enough protein?
Yeah, and I think it's also important for like I think the fact that I follow a vegan diet does not necessarily speak to my understanding of health, right? Because it's a diet that can have multiple motives. Like it's more of an ethical stance than anything else for a lot of people. Like I don't tell people it's the only way to be healthy. If I'm only counseling someone on health, it's very clear that like all these healthy dietary patterns, Mediterranean, DASH diet, Ornish diet, all these other ones that you see are mostly plant predominant diets. They're high in fiber, low in saturated fat. This is very clearly reducing our risk from a preventative standpoint for different cancers, for heart disease, and that's becoming more and more clear. But like, I don't think that there's a benefit necessarily from strictly a health standpoint to being 100% plant-based versus 90% plant-based. Like if you're incorporating fish, low-fat dairy, it's convenient for you and there's other benefits from that. I don't at all think that's an issue. But going back to your question about protein, I mean, it goes back to total protein goals. When I give lectures on nutrition, I've had people tell me afterwards that they would have no idea that I'm vegan because like I don't think it's relevant to the data. What's up? Because I'm Jack.
What are the top sources?
Top sources of plant-based proteins? Yeah, because that goes back to what we were saying. Like if you're trying to cut down on like red meat and saturated fat intake and things like that, and you're trying to switch to more fish, low-fat dairy, plant-based sources of protein, you could look at things like tofu, tempeh. Those are soy-based ones. If you don't want as much soy-based ones, you could look at things like seitan, which is made from wheat gluten, lentils. Like we don't eat a lot of lentils. That's like one thing where like legumes and pulses and like a lot of other populations benefit a lot from that we have in the US. If we look at just in general, and now we're getting into just general disease risk standpoint, what is the healthiest dietary patterns? Like there's no one diet, but it's going to be the ones that are rich in like whole grains, nuts, seeds, fruits, vegetables. Like if that's 80 to 90% of your calories, the rest doesn't make too much of a difference. And trying to get your, the American Heart Association, all these dietary guidelines recommend trying to get your protein sources from lower saturated fat options like fish, low-fat dairy and plant-based sources. And so the concern with that was, can you still achieve the same level of muscle growth? And at that point of roughly 1.6 grams per kilogram, you can. And so that's kind of what it comes down to. Like, for the longest time, just to prove a point, I was getting like 200 grams of protein a day without protein powder. But then I realized that was very unnecessary. Probably just overcompensating. But
I have one question.
yeah.
Related to that. Now, does your serving size tend to have to be greater just because, I don't know, I guess per ounce or I don't know, kilograms in those plant-based proteins?
Yeah.
They're probably not as rich in protein as like a chicken breast or steak.
So the way I'm going to sit if you guys don't mind. The way it differs is going back to these essential amino acids. So when you look at animal proteins versus plant proteins and the essential amino acid content, animal proteins tend to have basically the levels of essential amino acids, like each one, that your body needs, enough to get, over these thresholds of your goals for each amino acid. And so people used to, and whereas in plant proteins, some might be higher in some essential might be higher in other ones. And so people use sort of things like pairing rice and beans to try to match up and get a, quote, complete protein. So all 9 essential amino acids are present in plant proteins. It's more of just the ratio that they're in. And these studies that I'm talking about, where it's like 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, and they had different arms get protein from different sources, as long as they were eating enough total protein and not all from one source, they hit their markers for essential amino acid intake for all of them. So it really goes back to, short answer, hitting that total goal and not just getting all your protein from one source, and it's not something you have to worry about because you get the same. And there's actually a really good review paper. If you don't want to read a bunch of different studies, I can send you guys a good review paper that was published last month that basically assessed plant-based proteins and athletic performance compared to animal-based proteins. And long story short, showed the same level of athletic performance, assuming you hit these total protein goals. So it's more of considering, in addition to the athletic performance, like preventative from a disease risk standpoint. Because things like heart disease, it takes 4 or 5 decades to develop, and your risk is not just, that's what I tell people who are like, oh, I'm young right now and it's fine. It's a cumulative risk of exposure. So how many years have you been exposed to these high levels of LDL in your blood and different lipids that determines your risk later on. So, any other questions about protein? Or anything? Yeah.
I noticed that I'm seeing more. I've been practicing 28 years.
Yeah.
I like a lot of what you're saying. Right? A lot of people look intermittent fasting, so you worry about that anabolic window, right? I don't have to worry about that anymore.
Yeah.
Total protein for the day, so you kind of build that up and less saturated fat sources better.
Yeah.
Better. I noticed that oral immunity is more prevalent in the last 10 years. I haven't actually looked up the study.
Yeah.
I just noticed that patients talk about it more. Is there any correlation to diet, environment, anything?
Yeah, so autoimmune conditions, I would say, are probably our least understood, just because it's so complex and it's multifactorial. So it's really hard to isolate a single cause because it's genetic risk combined with environmental factors from diet, stress, all these different things. There's things like we've seen associations with whether you were born, from C-section versus vaginal birth, and your risk of like asthma as a kid, because your gut microbiome makeup is different. So there's so much that we're learning right now, and I would say autoimmune diseases are at least understood. So it's a little bit hard to comment on definitively, but it's not just autoimmune disease. All of our diseases are going up at pretty rapid rates. It's estimated that more than 60% of the U.S. population soon will either be pre-diabetic or diabetic, which is fucking insane now that I can curse. Just for emphasis. Yeah, so I don't really have a great answer for that. And then you mentioned... Yeah, so there's more and more understanding that it might be related to gut microbiome makeup. which again, if you want to diversify your gut microbiome, the best thing you can do is actually eating a lot of prebiotic fiber from a lot of different sources. That's what feeds these gut bacteria.
Do you eat them like the sauerkraut and stuff like that? Do you eat that?
Yeah, so I can give a quick overview of like the gut standpoint, and I can also I have a 45-minute PowerPoint on gut microbiome, so I can share that with you guys too. But so basically, there's prebiotics, probiotics, and postbiotics. These are all terms you guys have probably heard. So probiotics are the bacteria themselves, the good bacteria. Prebiotics is the food for the good bacteria, and then postbiotics are what the good bacteria produce that have all the beneficial effects. So prebiotics, the main one is going to be dietary fiber. And this is why fiber intake is so important. And one of the mechanisms we think by which it works is by promoting proliferation of all these healthy gut bacteria or probiotics. The thing they produce, one of the main postbiotics, is short chain fatty acids. Now, a lot of people, you asked about sauerkraut, what else? Kefir, all these different sources of probiotics. I mean, it can't hurt. And we just don't have solid data that more probiotics necessarily result in better health outcomes. And the reason why is because if you look at like a probiotic supplement or probiotics from these foods, you're only getting a handful of strains of bacteria, but you have thousands of different strains of good bacteria in your gut. And so you're only causing proliferation of 4 or 5 different subtypes of bacteria. Now, if you're eating a variety of different sources of dietary fiber, you're now feeding all of those like different good bacteria. So in terms of bang for your buck, you actually probably get more. So I don't think it can hurt. Like I don't tell people to waste too much money on probiotic supplements, but I still try to have like kombucha or like all these different things that have live cultures, kimchi. But you get more bang for your buck from prebiotics, like dietary fiber.
15 years ago, I had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma,
Mhm.
and so I got introduced to plant-based enzymes.
Yeah.
And one of the products that we take, and I got to start taking more, that you're talking about it. One product is psyllium husk, right? That's a dietary
Yeah.
fiber. So
What was it? Sorry.
psyllium husk.
Yeah.
So there's one product that has that, it's a powder. And
Yeah.
whenever I would take that before, well, really shouldn't have been, before I went out drinking,
Yeah.
or if I went out to a restaurant, I would eat a lot less. So I think it's probably a good thing to do before you get eat.
Yeah.
Blood sugar will be better. You'll get that prebiotic that you're talking about.
Yeah. It's hard to.
I might start
It's so complex. Like there's just interactions. Like you would think that one thing happens. Like okay, this sounds nice in theory, so let me eat. Like people with certain autoimmune conditions, we look at their gut microbiome and they have less of certain species of gut bacteria. So it's like, let's just supplement them with that and then it goes away, but it doesn't, because it's just so much more complex. Like, there's relationships too between like stress and autoimmune conditions. So it's like, this is so complex and multifactorial. And also like, I didn't mention this earlier, but I'm interested in oncology. And so like, I do a lot of research looking at like the intersection between nutrition and cancer. So I'm actually writing a paper right now on nutrition and blood cancer. So if you want to see that, I can definitely send it to you. Yeah. Yeah.
My white blood cell count went from 5 down to 1.5.
Yeah.
So my energy was zapped. So they did my friend ordered a stool sample on me, loaded with fungus.
Yeah.
So I took a product called Lauricidin.
Okay.
Just concentrated coconut pellets. 1 scoop is like a 5-gallon tub, and it immediately opened up my bowels. And within a week, my blood count went from 1.5 to 5.
Yeah.
Pretty crazy.
Yeah.
It killed all that stuff in my stomach.
There's a lot of stuff we just don't understand fully.
But they say the cancer cells, you would know a lot more than that. They'll see parasites and viruses and bacteria in that. Is that true?
So there's a few cancers that are associated with infections, like certain microorganisms, like and certain lymphomas, or like H. pylori and gastric cancer. But I mean, this is now me speaking not definitively, but I think there's more of an association between infectious processes and cancers that we might be seeing more of in the future. That's like completely what's the word I'm looking for? There's no foundation to what I'm saying, at least right now, but just something related to what you're saying.
You say that because when I was 18, I had baseball scholarships when I went out to Arizona State. I was going to try to walk on.
Yeah.
I got mono, and I was zapped. When I got cancer 15 years ago, I felt exactly the same. Like I just was
Mono, that virus is one of them that could be associated with. I forget if it's Hodgkin's or non-Hodgkin's, but I gotta check. But yeah.
Banana, a good prebiotic. Because people are like curious about prebiotics. Like, you don't have to buy
Yeah.
a supplement. For
Yeah.
prebiotics. Like what else you said? Is it the dietary?
It's dietary fiber, so it's like yeah, and there's more benefit to having variety of fiber sources than so if you're getting 30 grams of fiber a day, which is great, you're already doing better than most of the U.S. population, but you're getting it all from, let's say, chia seeds. You're going to feed certain populations of gut bacteria in your gut, but then everything else is not getting fed. So 30 grams of fiber from a lot of different sources has more benefit. Does that make sense? So there's power in the variety as well. So fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, things like that. Grains. We probably are pretty short on grains in general. And I think part of that comes from an unnecessary fear of all carbs. Like carbs kind of have a bad rep but eating a slice of white bread that's a refined grain stripped of all the fiber and nutrients is very different from eating quinoa or lentils or legumes, like all these different carb-rich foods that are whole grains. And not
on the individual.
not really. It's
there's some like I mean, you can't eat them raw.
yeah, but that kind of goes for most things. If you eat like raw chicken or raw fish, like yeah, but you could run into issues eating most things raw. Which is why we have
Some things that gut doesn't do as good a job with like certain quinoas, like a tri-blended quinoa doesn't always digest like a white quinoa.
Yeah. So
I got a cool story. We have some really cool patients in South. One guy's the producer of ballers and entourage.
oh, cool.
So he comes in 2 weeks ago. He's like, try this water. So I'm always struggling to get like recovery. I hate the Gatorades. I hate the Vital Waters. I don't like the sucralose. I don't like the aspartame. It's all hidden there. I'm not crazy about monk food. I'm not crazy about stevia. This guy makes a water with HMB, beta hydroxybutyrate, precursor to leucine.
Yep.
And protein synthesis.
Yeah.
And so I drank it. Unreal.
Yeah.
So Steph Curry is actually spokesman for Nirvana, but this is stuff that's in GNCs now, and they'll start carrying it in anatomy. It's pretty cool, but it's got, I don't know how much HMB it has.
Yeah.
But they say that after 2 weeks your recovery is a lot better.
Yeah. So that kind of goes back to what I was saying.
No crap. It's all flavored, citric flavored.
Yeah.
Clean.
So he's saying HMB, for those of you guys who don't know what it is a precursor to leucine, which is one of the essential amino acids that's highly anabolic and triggers muscle protein synthesis. So that's like, on a daily basis, if you're hitting enough protein, probably not necessary, but I was saying one of the examples of times where I'm more cognizant of protein intake is like if you're injured and you can't work out for a few weeks and you really want to up your protein to try to make sure you don't lose a lot of lean mass. That was one time that I took HMB. Like my herniated disc, I was out of the gym for 6 weeks and I was like, I want to minimize how much strength I lose. So that's
That's a good point for my patients too.
yeah.
Yeah, I gotta tell them.
Yeah. Because again, it goes back to resistance training is going to lower your threshold for how much protein you need to trigger muscle protein synthesis. So if you don't have that to sensitize your muscles, you're going to need more protein to trigger muscle protein synthesis. Anything else? Henry, you're really quiet. Yeah, I love talking about this stuff. So we came up with a list of topics. I think electrolytes, like specific diseases like heart disease risk, diabetes, and nutrition, gut health, supplements. So I could talk about any of those or any topics that you guys have in the future. This is fun for me.
I like healthy sea salt, but what do you get for supplements?
I don't take much for supplements. I have a protein powder that I keep for days where if I'm going to be in the hospital for 12 hours not getting a meal, to help hit my protein goals for the day, but I don't use it on a daily basis. And then creatine. That's it. Those are the only supplements I take. And then I take a multivitamin to cover my bases if I think it's a smart bet for everyone. It's hard to hit every single nutrient all the time. So just a multivitamin to cover your bases, and then not going looking for any issues that you don't have. Like people being like, oh, I heard, about this supplement is a superfood herb that will cleanse my I don't know, chakras.
There's a nuanced protein most people don't know about called sacha inchi. And
Yeah.
It has like omegas that come along with it, similar to salmon and also pumpkin seed.
Yeah.
And so I once created a protein blend that was pea protein, pumpkin seed, and sacha inchi. And
That's
there
great.
wasn't anything really like it yet.
That's
because,
awesome.
Sacha inchi is from Peru, and it's lesser known about it. It's a seed.
Yeah.
It's a nut. They make an oil out of it, but
Yeah.
like that's something most people don't get access to, but it has all the essential omegas.
Yeah.
How does that play in with salmon and things that are hemp seed?
So I don't think the
Has omegas.
omega-3s play a role in terms of like athletic performance or interacting with the protein, but obviously from a health
What about
standpoint,
for like,
from a health
skin,
standpoint,
hair, nails, eyesight.
yeah,
function,
omega-3 is really important from a health standpoint.
right?
Yeah, and so fish is going to be,
Right?
yeah,
Three is
Yeah.
the most popular. But
yeah. So having a good source of omega-3 is probably the hardest to get for most people, but like fatty fish and then algae, like algae oil, some people do, or seaweed. Yeah, and then nuts and seeds are going to be your main sources of omega-3. That's really good from a health standpoint, but doesn't really interact much with protein.
Okay.
So it's good if it's in the
It's along
protein.
for the ride.
Yeah, it's like something else that's beneficial in the protein source that you have. Yeah, like I've seen some tofus where they add like plant-based omega-3s to it. It's like cool. All right, another health benefit from it. But yeah. All right.
Do you think about eating soaking nuts or eating raw? Some people believe enzymes that's better.
Lectins too.
Yeah. So I don't think it makes too much of a difference. I think one thing I've learned is nutrition, while it's nuanced, can also be simpler than we make it sometimes. I think that's one kind of takeaway from this protein talk. Like people obsessing about their anabolic window or their ratio of amino acids in their proteins and pairing different foods. Like hitting your total protein goal, working on your athletic performance, and then focusing on other aspects of your lifestyle, like sleeping consistently. One of the best things, stress management, making time for friends, like social engagement, and the effect that has on health often gets underplayed, especially among gym bros. Like nobody's gonna be like, oh, I gotta have a good sense of community. They're gonna be like, no, I want to eat fucking 20 pounds of red meat today so that I can have maximal gains. So it all plays into your health.
Primal diet.
Primal diet. What is
Carnivore.
carnivore?
Just throwing out random.
I have a pretty nuanced and like I don't make hard statements about many things, but that might be one of the dumbest diets and most dangerous diets in existence. Just every piece of evidence shows that it's the worst idea for health. And people say like, oh, but I feel better in the short term, and they look at like their cholesterol's 400, and it's like now we're starting to see, because it's been around for 5 to 10 years, like 30-year-olds having heart attacks. But this is not the side that you see, because you just see like some guy shirtless online talking about how much better he feels eating primally because he's really insecure. Which is also ironic because like our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. We've like found like fossilized feces, and so like 90% of their foods were plant-based. They were eating 150 grams of fiber a day. They only caught an animal, like wild game, once a week or something like that. And they were catching like antelope, which is 7% saturated fat, as opposed to our foods today. So, but again, we shouldn't base our current diet based on what our ancestors did. They lived to 30. They didn't live long enough to have heart disease because they died of infection. So I think it's I don't make a lot of definitive statements, but that will probably go down as one of the most dangerous dietary fads in history. And it's sad because people won't be held accountable. Like you got a shirtless guy online screaming about it, being like, you could look like me, and now you got 30-year-olds having heart attacks, and it's really scary stuff. It's sad. Like the online space is super unregulated too. And
free range versus farm fed, with corn.
Yeah,
Beef.
Yes.
Thing in the industry.
So you want to separate?
Fish as well.
Yeah.
Salmon they're feeding.
So you want to separate like processed meats versus unprocessed meats, and we definitely see different health outcomes for sure. Like the cancer risks are a lot more clear with processed meats than unprocessed meat, and the amount you'd have to take in of unprocessed meat to have the same level of cancer. It's like what I tell people: everything's dose dependent. So, you know, every, I think, 100 grams of unprocessed red meat per day increases your colon cancer risk by 17%. You decide how much processed meat you want to eat with that statistic. Every 100 grams of unprocessed red meat, even like the highest quality, organic, grass-fed, whatever, per day increases it by 12%. So everybody has a different risk threshold, you know? How much does that stuff matter? I think there's a lack of transparency with our food system and how a lot of it gets done. So it's really hard to say. But in those studies I was referencing where they looked at the highest quality unprocessed red meat, like it was organic, grass-fed versus Impossible and Beyond Meat, it still did worse in terms of lipids than, because the saturated fat content's still high, it's going to raise your lipids, still did worse than the imitation meats. So it probably is better than but again, what are you comparing it to? It's probably better than processed meat, but it's probably not better than
have higher nutrient content when they're eating a more superior diet.
like when they're eating grass. I tell people, why don't we just eat the grass? Yeah. Yeah, but it depends on what you're comparing it to. Yeah. So.
I love that you brought up the 100 calories. We always reference that.
Oh yeah.
That means 150 grams of fiber a day. That's
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny, they want to be like their ancestors until you tell them to not take a shower. Until you tell them to stop brushing their teeth. Like, go take a shit in the bush and tell me you want to be like your ancestors. All right, I think we covered a lot, and I think we're definitely overdue on time. I hope. Thank you. I enjoy talking about this stuff, so like I welcome calls, texts anytime about it. Okay. Yeah. All right. What's up?
Shout out for your Instagram.
Oh yeah, I do have an Instagram page. The handle is _plantitude. It's like plant and attitude. _plantitude. And I just debunk a lot of misconceptions and stuff like that. So.
You also challenge some of the leading experts through DMs I saw.
Yes. Yeah, because you got these people just saying what they want online, and they say no. You know. Yeah, and it's not like black or white. You know, some of them. Yeah. No problem.